Good. Thank you, Ramona. As some of you know, I'm afraid I haven't been very well this month, so I haven't really been able to write a new paper for this occasion. So what I'm doing now is giving you a slightly adapted version of a paper I wrote earlier this year for the launch of the first Romanian translation of Concluding Unscientific Postscript. Not that I gave the paper in Romanian, of course, but in English, and they politely listened. And that was called After Kierkegaard. And I think it connects with the title Kierkegaard and Existential Philosophy, because Kierkegaard and existential philosophy is something, of course, that happened after Kierkegaard. Existential philosophy in the modern sense is part of the Wirkungsgeschichte, the effective history of Kierkegaard's writings. Now, of course, you could say, I guess Shestov would say, that one can also talk about existential philosophy before Kierkegaard. One could talk about Pascal, or Luther, or Augustine, or Paul, or Jeremiah, or Job in the Bible, perhaps even one or two figures from Greek philosophy. So, and perhaps there's always been, as it were, a thin red line of existential thinkers, but it is only after Kierkegaard that we come to call it and to understand it as existential philosophy, largely because of the treatment of the word existence and existential precisely in Kierkegaard's Concluding Unscientific Postscript. That Kierkegaard, as it were, gives that word a new shape, a new resonance in usage that, as Heidegger will say at the beginning of Being and Time, marks it out as something very different from the medieval existentia. So that when Heidegger himself talks about existenz, and he likes to play on existenz in German versus existentia in Latin, and for him these are not the same thing at all. The umbrella on the table exists in the Latin sense. It is an object there that exists, but it doesn't exist in the sense that Dasein exists, thrown anxiously towards its death. So, of course, we all come after Kierkegaard in the sense that none of us were living when Kierkegaard died in 1855. So at a purely banal level, of course, we are all after Kierkegaard. But even though that's a rather banal comment to start with, I think it's not without significance. We all come after Kierkegaard, that is to say, not just in terms of dates, but we are all born into social, economic, cultural, and intellectual worlds very different from the world of newly democratic Denmark in the year 1855, let alone the autocratic, bombed out incidentally by Great Britain in the first use of rocket warfare to attack a civilian population in modern history, and destitute Denmark of 1813, when Kierkegaard was born. A Denmark that throughout this time was religiously and ethnically monochrome to a degree scarcely comparable with any European country today, let alone modern North America, for example. So historical distance is, I think, an important factor to take into account when dealing with any figure of the past, but particularly difficult in a way to deal with in the, as it were, relatively recent past, which is often closer than we imagine. I know a lady still living in Denmark who remembers as a child meeting Nietzsche's sister. Indeed, she still has a purse given to her by Auntie Elizabeth. Not to mention, I think she had a blue elephant given by Uncle Martin as well. She moved in interesting circles. There may be some still living, say people born in 1917, whose lives overlapped with those, with the last years of Kierkegaard. Indeed, Kierkegaard's fiancée, Regina Olsen, didn't die until the beginning of the 20th century. So it's past, it's different, but in a way it's not so far into the past. Nevertheless, between our time and his, a certain gulf is fixed. Several waves of industrial and technological innovation have transformed multiple aspects of our lives, from space travel to iPhones to human reproduction. World wars, tyrannies, and population shifts have made and remade nations. Religions have converged and merged or rebounded into new patterns of hostility. Education has been universalized, but few university students now arrive reading Latin and Greek, not even those commencing classical studies, and very few theology students, if any, could even begin to translate the New Testament from Greek into Latin, as Kierkegaard and his cohort were expected to do as part of their basic theological training. And as for Kierkegaard's sexual anxieties, we don't have those. So 200 years is both a short and a long time. And as these fairly random list of changes that have been occurring in the last 200 years indicates, much can happen in such a length of time. And some might say that the cumulative effect of such changes requires us to think of Kierkegaard's time as a different time, a different age. In 1914, Theodor Hecker published his translation of the last part of Kierkegaard's review of a novel called Two Ages under the title Critique of the Present, Kritik der Gegenwart. Hecker and his readers in 1914 seemed spontaneously to recognize Kierkegaard's age as their own, but Kierkegaard was only now, as it were, finding the age to which to speak. And that's a significant moment in Kierkegaard reception because one can say that in the first decade, in the period leading up to the First World War, up to 1914, a number of commentators have spoken of a kind of proto-existentialism emerging, particularly in Austria-Hungary, where Kierkegaard started to be translated into German and to acquire not just a large readership, but a very significant readership, be impacting upon people as varied as George Lukács, who wrote one of the first important critical essays on Kierkegaard outside Denmark, future important Marxist theorist, Martin Buber, who said that his intellectual awakening came from reading Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, Franz Kafka. A selection of Kierkegaard's journals was published at that time in German under the title Buch des Richters, the Book of the Judge. And again, this has a sort of certain resonance. That wasn't Kierkegaard's title for the selection, but the idea that Kierkegaard was someone, as it were, come to judge the present age with his own rigorous standards. And in fact, the publishing house that published the Kritik der Gegenwart was the Brenner Press. And the Brenner, der Brenner was an important radical journal. One doesn't really usually associate the Tyrol with radical thinking, but the Brenner was an important vehicle for a sort of mishmash, if you like, of Nietzsche, mysticism, Lebensphilosophy, mountain climbing, and all sorts of out there stuff, including Kierkegaard. And it was in Der Brenner that a number of the first German translations of Kierkegaard's discourses appeared, often translated by Theodor Hecker. A particularly important edition, which some think has a special importance for Martin Heidegger, was a 1915 edition of Der Brenner in memoriam Georg Trakl, the German expressionist poet who died in 1915 serving in the German army, and that also included Kierkegaard's discourse at a graveside. So it was, as it were, a death issue of Der Brenner, which quite possibly had a particular impact for Heidegger. So in 1914, in this sort of proto-existentialist era, Kierkegaard seems to be coming into his own, to speaking to the age as his own age. After the First World War, Kierkegaard's relevance seemed even more obvious, and especially in Germany, the German-speaking world, everyone who was anyone tried to enroll Kierkegaard in their cause. Jaspers, Heidegger, Karl Barth, Romano Guardini, leading Catholic theologian, even Nazi ideologists such as Alfred Bäumer tried to claim Kierkegaard as one of their own. It has been said that you could look at German intellectual history in this period as a sort of succession of Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky. Up until the First World War, Nietzsche, the idea that we can make the new man through our own powerful will, our will to power. Then the catastrophe of the First World War revealing the limits of, as it were, a solely humanist endeavour, and so people turned to Kierkegaard and the need, as it were, for something wholly other, coming from above, from outside of the human condition. But then, through the 1920s, a certain dissatisfaction with Kierkegaardian individualism leading to a turn more to Dostoevsky, where one sees some of these existential motifs, but a much more communal view of human life and the idea of finding religious and personal fulfillment through identification with the people. Of course, for the German commentators, Dostoevsky had got the wrong people. But you just needed to sort of change Dostoevsky's Russian nationalism into sort of German nationalism, and you'd get the right answer, as it were. And there's, of course, dark stuff going on there. So through that period, Kierkegaard is very much a contemporary, if you like. Can we say the same? Even, one might say today, there's a certain revival of, if not existentialism, of existential thinking. But is that enough to make Kierkegaard our contemporary? Kierkegaard is nevertheless hailed by some as the first critic of the internet, thus Hubert Dreyfus, the guide to post-national identity, Martin Matuszczyk, and if not yet as a sexual counsellor, then at least someone who can teach us important lessons in love, and a number of contemporary philosophers use Kierkegaard as a resource in the currently very topical philosophical issue of love. Each of these areas is controversial and debatable. I do think, as a matter of fact, that he has much to say that's relevant to the critique of contemporary technologies, to contemporary political debates, and is indeed especially insightful on the subject of love. But what we as scholars wouldn't wish to deny, of course, is that we can't just go on remaking Kierkegaard in our own image, as it were. History will have its dues, and if we don't pay them, then the question isn't Kierkegaard's relevance, but our commitment to truth. And even though, of course, Kierkegaard privileges subjective truth over objective truth, he would always say that, of course, in scholarship, objective truth is important. It's no good saying the Battle of Waterloo was fought in 1816, because it wasn't. You can't. Subjective truth doesn't mean you can just move stuff around randomly. In this regard, it's an important moment in Kierkegaard's studies and reception that we now have a new Danish edition of his work produced with an extraordinarily thorough apparatus. I mean, there may be one or two very minor facts about Kierkegaard's sources out there, but really hardly ever. This doesn't answer all the historical questions. It provides unprecedented materials for answering them. So, and thanks to this kind of research, the context-free Kierkegaard, whom philosophers, theologians, and others could turn into whatever they wanted him to turn into, usually a placeholder for one or other versions of irrationalism, may still appear from time to time, because roguery is perennial, as is laziness, but he's been stripped of any alibi he may once have claimed. The historical material is out there if you want to know how much Luther Kierkegaard read, how much Johannes Tauler he read, how much even more obscure things he read. You can go and find out. And if you don't, that's up to you. But of course, that's history, if you like. We're not all historians, and perhaps most of us don't want to be. We come to Kierkegaard because his words, written or spoken or electronically transmitted, have made us hopeful that he may have something to say that we need to hear regarding our existential or scholarly pursuits regarding problems of knowledge, nature of subjectivity, the paradoxes of writing, the character of God, the demands of love, or whatever other issue we make the focus of our studies. Perhaps in the beginning, our question isn't clearly articulated. Perhaps, probably, it's part of a cluster of questions that may lead us to diverse aspects of Kierkegaard's work or to his intellectual adversaries, It may lead us to be readers of Kierkegaard and Marx, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, Kierkegaard and Heidegger, though whether and in what ways each of these may be counted as an adversary or an ally of Kierkegaard is of course open to debate. In point of fact, the historian's task is in principle never-ending. But even if it could ever be brought to an end, even if we could actually reconstruct Kierkegaard as he was in his own time, entirely repeating each nuance of his sensibility and thought, this wouldn't answer our questions at all. In fact, it would merely take us back to the beginning, to the question as to what we might learn by looking backwards to this man. In what ways did he look forwards to us? If historical questions will always remain open, then it looks as if we're going to have to live with a double-edged margin of uncertainty. On the one hand, with regard to what Kierkegaard meant in his own time and place, on the other, with the openness of the questions that have led us to engage with him in the first place. Even when historians have done their job, there will still be questions to ask about the historical Kierkegaard. But even more undoubtedly, universal consensus on the meaning of subjectivity, the meaning of God, or the meaning of love isn't going to happen soon, not even when the discussion has been informed by the best of Kierkegaard. And so our interpretations will always come with cautionary notes regarding corrigibility and revisability. Even in the case of the most passionate theses, we must, to invoke Oliver Cromwell, consider that we may be mistaken, or at least that there is always more work to be done. Now, some may worry that this is sounding like relativism, undecidability, and other, to some, unwelcome postmodern tendencies, and may even detect a touch of nihilism. But really the point I'm making is just an old-fashioned one about the difficulty of doing good work in humanistic study. Because today we're always encouraged to say at the start of any project what the outcomes of our project is going to be. But it's pretty difficult, may take many years even to formulate the question we want to ask. The questions that can be answered definitively are usually not the interesting questions. The interesting questions, the kind of questions that matter to Plato and Aristotle, or for that matter Paul or Job, are just not the kinds of questions for which we can find answers in Wikipedia. But in the case of Kierkegaard, there's more. Heidegger said that the unifying thought of any great thinker was the thought he was unable to think, an idea he illustrated by reference to Socrates. Like much of what Heidegger said, it sounds rather strange at first, but in some ways it is just common sense. Why are we talking about Kierkegaard today, for example, and not H.L. Martensen, a contemporary who became professor of theology at Copenhagen, later the leading bishop of Denmark, and who for a while was Kierkegaard's undergraduate tutor? Why? Because Martensen was a man who had all the answers for all the questions that he ever asked himself or that anyone else ever asked him. That's why he was a clear expositor of Christian dogmatics and well suited for episcopal office. That's why he, unlike Kierkegaard, was translated into English in his own lifetime and hailed by T&T Clark in a blurb for one of his books as Lutheranism's greatest living theologian. But all of that is also why we no longer read him today, except out of historical interest, usually as a footnote to Kierkegaard. The questions having been answered, there's nothing there by which we can clarify our own most urgent questions. There's nothing there that speaks to our ultimate concerns. Martensen did a good and thorough job of what was demanded of him in his day, but that's it. That Kierkegaard does not impose answers until the answers are ready for free and gracious bestowal. That's surely integral to what makes Kierkegaard of interest to us 200 years on. If Kierkegaard had as fully explained Kierkegaard as Martensen explained Martensen, his writings too would be mouldering on the 20-krone shelves of the Bethesda bookstore in Copenhagen, and we would never have had a Kierkegaard research centre or a network of Kierkegaard societies. So that we come, in the banal sense, after Kierkegaard is not of itself what makes Kierkegaard interesting. In the same sense, we come after Martinson and after many less interesting figures than that. But there's something unresolved in Kierkegaard that addresses what we find unresolved and disturbing in our own intellectual, cultural, and even personal situation. 200 years creates a certain historical problem, and it's one that we have to acknowledge as scholars. History slows us down. We're obliged to consult the historian and the philologist. We have to take that into account. But history is also the condition of Kierkegaard's becoming of interest to us. That we see Kierkegaard's question as potentially resonating in or with our own question means that in some sense, despite the passage of time, we share or could share a common historical horizon. That's not a matter of simple continuity between 1813 and 2017. Maybe it's a horizon, a historical horizon that hasn't yet been projected, let alone established, that the time we actually share with Kierkegaard hasn't yet arrived. So the problem is not how to find continuity between now and whenever Kierkegaard lived in the past, but to find, as it were, the time, the era, the epoch that we and Kierkegaard really do share. In that sense, perhaps our true historical connection to Kierkegaard has not yet been asked. And it's precisely the struggle and hope of interpretation that we might find that historical horizon. That it's with Kierkegaard, or through our engagement with Kierkegaard, and not, let's say, with Martinson, that this history takes or starts to take shape, is why there's another more significant sense that we're after Kierkegaard than the simple historical fact that we're all born after 1855. It's this sense indicated in the title of Archbishop Bruno Forte's little book, Fare Teologia dopo Kierkegaard, Doing Theology After Kierkegaard. And remarkable that a contemporary Catholic bishop in Italy should write a book with that title. In this sense, even if we're restricting ourselves to a limited field of inquiry such as theology, we understand Kierkegaard as a thinker of epochal significance who defines a certain history, a certain trajectory of thought and even life. We don't do theology after Martinson, but most of us do theology or philosophy after Hegel, after Nietzsche, after Barth, after Heidegger. There are some figures who are not just, as it were, chronologically important in the history of philosophy, but who create a new horizon. And of course, that doesn't imply agreement with any of these figures. It may sometimes indicate or make possible strong disagreement. But when it's a matter of disagreement, it's also the kind of disagreement that means recognizing we can't move on until the matter has been sorted out, or at least dealt with an appropriate seriousness. And inevitably the judgment that such and such a thinker marks an epochal division in a field or even life is contestable and debatable. Being one of those who regard Heidegger as just such a defining history, just such a defining figure in the history of modern European thought, I'm also profoundly aware that there are others, most analytic philosophers, who, for example, who thinks he says nothing that would make it worth their while to read him. Kierkegaard's reputation, too, seems to invite such questions. While it seemed obvious in 1920s Weimar Germany that the fate of both theological and philosophical and perhaps even political thinking, think of the citation of Kierkegaard by the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt, depended on fully realizing all that could be learned from Kierkegaard, others, even many who find him interesting to a certain degree, would also say, well, yeah, he's interesting, but he's a marginal figure, a niche market, an occasional interest. A halfway house would be someone like Karl Barth, evidenced in his rather condescending remark that whilst the best theologians would be able to learn much by attending the school of Kierkegaard, they would also be well advised to pass out of it to other schools. But as Rosenzweig said of Hermann Cohen, the school teacher always dies with the school, but the master lives on. So if then we're thinking after Kierkegaard in the emphatic sense, This isn't because we've been schooled by Kierkegaard and have now passed on to other schools, but precisely because there is that in Kierkegaard which cannot be constrained within the limits of the kinds of schools that rise and fall within the institutions of modern scholarly and religious life. A shortcut to what I mean might simply be to say what's distinctive about Kierkegaard, what makes him an epochal figure in modern theology, modern philosophy, even modern life, is his articulation of existential passion. His proclamation that whether we're theologizing, philosophizing, loving, or praying, we should be doing so in full awareness that we are concretely existing, temporal, finite, passionate individuals. Heidegger's assistant, Werner Brock, who came to Britain in the 1930s, being Jewish, summed up Kierkegaard's meaning for German philosophy in the one word, existence. And if that word excites us less when we're 60 years old than it did when we were 16, it's still not a bad word. And if it is indeed the case that our excitement has dimmed, we might also pause to check whether, having become less excited by existence, we're also less excited by God, by love, by birdsong, by the sea, or the many other things that we generally think make life worth living. Existence, of course, can be glossed in different ways. As thrownness towards death, as standing before the face of the God who is the giver of every good and perfect gift, for example, perhaps Heidegger's and Kierkegaard's respective views of what is at the heart of existence. Yet perhaps philosophers of death and theologians of creation and hope, not to mention lovers of literary Schattenspielen, might recognize a difference between those whose intellectual conceptions leapt in the womb at the word existence, as Kierkegaard said his did when he heard the word uttered by Schelling in a lecture in Berlin in 1841, and those who thought that modal logic and the view from nowhere might be better starting places for their inquiries. Yet existence, even existence itself, of course, is an abstract noun. When did we last see existence any more than we last saw beauty or the good or art? I mean, I've been in lots of art galleries, seen lots of paintings, but I've never seen art as such standing there to be spectated. Comment of Hegel's that a person goes into a greengrocer's and says, I want some fruit. And the girl says, well, what do you want, apples, oranges, bananas, or whatever you had in Baden-Württemberg in those days? And he says, no, I want fruit, give me fruit. But there is no fruit to be had. So what about this existence? And of course, though existentialists, as it were, claim the word existence, red-blooded empiricists too might claim existing human beings as their own, as reflecting the claims of real life against the abstractions of philosophers and the daydreams of romantics. Feuerbach spoke too about the primacy of existence and thinking in existence. But Feuerbach's materialist conception of existence is clearly not Kierkegaard's. Not that Kierkegaard's existing human beings are incorporeal. Blood flows in their veins. They live and breathe, and undoubtedly they will die. And if they're knights of faith, they also look quite like the most down-to-earth, red-blooded, feet-on-the-ground bourgeois realists who ever lived, at least according to Fear and Trembling. So existence is more than just existing, but involves a certain way of existing, having a certain relation to our existence as the temporal, finite, and that means mortal, beings that we are. One word for this relation that perhaps philosophers and theologians might be able to agree on is truth, so that an existential thinker is one who faces up to and is ready to endure the truth of seeing him or herself in the light of their temporality, finitude, and mortality. And there's an interesting comment. Heidegger, on the whole, seems to have finished with Kierkegaard by the end of the 1930s, but he makes an interesting comment about Kierkegaard's pseudonymity in his lectures from 1943 on Parmenides, on the word truth, on what he means by aletheia. And Heidegger, of course, is wanting to replace the traditional view of truth as correspondence with truth as aletheia, which he understands as unconcealment. Truth and the discovery of truth as a process of revealing and concealing. And he says that's just what Kierkegaard's pseudonyms do. It's not that each of the pseudonyms is a distinct position, but each pseudonym represents an aspect, or brings to expression an aspect of Kierkegaard's thought, whilst concealing another aspect. In these pseudonymous writings we see a play of concealing and revealing. Heidegger seems to think that's one of the first occurrences of this new understanding of truth in modern thought. Another key word here might be singularity, which may be what Derrida had in mind when he spoke of his faithfulness to Kierkegaard. And perhaps another might be the good. That precisely our exposure as singular, temporal, finite, mortal individuals is so far from being a spur to Sartrean nausea as to be a standing invitation to attend to those fellow human beings we see as standing in exactly the same predicament and to seek to do them good. I mentioned before the possibility of Heidegger having been particularly struck by Kierkegaard's discourse at a graveside, but it's interesting that whereas Heidegger sees death as what most singularizes us, no one else can do my dying for us, Kierkegaard's writings about death, he emphasizes that actually death is what unites us in our common humanity. Although, of course, I must take seriously the fact that I will die, this fact that I will die is also operative for every other human being. When we're dealing with death, we're dealing with what concerns all of us, and in the relation to death, we are all in exactly the same situation, whether we're going to die tomorrow or in 20 years' time. So there will be partings of the ways in reading Kierkegaard after Kierkegaard. Many people have read Kierkegaard as saying much the same as Heidegger about death, though I think that's just because they don't read him carefully. And even if we negotiate a common path through the disputed terrain of historical reconstruction, even if we resist recruiting Kierkegaard as an ally in one or other contemporary cause, even if we allow ourselves to remain questioners in the face of his texts and the questions to which they direct us, we will diverge. And how, in relation to a thinker who is a thinker of the singular, temporal, finite, mortal individual, could it be otherwise? For when Kierkegaard is thinking his own singular and unthinkable thought, the thought that most emphatically marks him out as the thinker that he is, then precisely then we cannot understand him. There are, of course, many things in Kierkegaard that are, in principle, readily understandable. His critique of idealist philosophy, you could write an essay about that, get it right, more or less. His analysis of the present age, it's kind of fairly straightforward. His ideas about beauty or aesthetic form, it's strange sometimes, but, work on it and you'll get there. So Kierkegaard lived and wrote as a contemporary of his contemporaries, participating in their debates and discussions, learning from them, arguing with them. Perhaps a larger part of his writings can be understood within the horizons of what Schleiermacher called the comparative aspect of hermeneutics. But when Kierkegaard is most Kierkegaard, most singularly Kierkegaard, and no longer just a Hegelian or an anti-Hegelian, a Christian or Christendom's severest critic, we can, in principle, no longer understand him. And this is a different kind of non-understanding, I suggest, from our failure to understand perhaps the philosophy of Bertrand Russell, of Hegel, of Husserl, even maybe of Sartre, though it might have some analogy with what happens when we are reading Wittgenstein or Heidegger. The issue here isn't simply God. Now, it's true that many philosophers, continental and analytic in this regard, and most cultural studies students will simply turn off when Kierkegaard starts to talk about God, or else will radically reinterpret whatever he says about God or about the incarnation in purely human terms, as in Sartre's comment that each of us is the absolute paradox, the universal singular. For Kierkegaard himself, as for Augustine and Calvin, knowledge of God and knowledge of the self are so intertwined that there seems to be an unavoidable communicatio idiomatum between God and self, even if that has to be immediately qualified by saying that it's also often, most decisively, an inverse communication. But even in this regard, our suffering is not the inverse image of divine joy, but for good Christological reasons also the site of the divine suffering in which we find our human joy. So what it is to suffer, what it is to be joyful, for Kierkegaard, as for other key Christian thinkers, is inseparable from discovering what it would mean for God to suffer, or for God to be joyful. But even if we take God out of the equation, the Kierkegaardian self, to the extent that it remains a Kierkegaardian self and hasn't been, as it were, subtly changed into a Kantian, a Hegelian, a Feuerbachian or a Nietzschean self, remains a dizzyingly mobile centre of complex affective, volitional and intellectual relationality. A self whose life is articulated in a flow of words that play an ever-changing sequence of variations on modern languages, classical, biblical, philosophical, vernacular, high and low cultural, passionate, humorous and ironic possibilities, and sometimes all of these in just one sentence. But is there a centre? Or is there only ever an open-ended play of words and images on the glittering and ephemeral surface of time? Well, let's say that's how it is, that a human life is simply the event of a certain projection, distended or thrown along an empty surface, spread over an abyss of 70,000 fathoms of water. What then? Decentered as we are by the trauma of such a throw, what alternative do we have but to look outwards, beyond ourselves, towards others, so as to get back some word that might confirm us in our hope that if we are only such stuff as dreams are made of, we're not just a dream dreamed by some fantastical romantic night. N-I-G-H-T. But how can we call out unless we are also called, called to, called upon? And what is this interplay of calling and being called, but the exigent and sovereign call of love? Do yourself no harm, for we are all here, as the novelist Hermann Broch cried out in opposition to the totalitarianism of the 20th century. Is it then at that point a case of heteronomy if we, or at least some of us, find that the 70,000 fathoms of water beneath us have become transparent to a radiance and a joy for which the word of ontological gratitude, thanks be to God, forces itself upon us? Forces, as the precise word, forces itself on the free enterprise of the poet. Or is there only the endless turbulence of a wild wind that comes from nowhere and goes nowhere, a vortex endlessly consuming itself, as the fictional aesthetes of Kierkegaard's either-or supposed to be the case? Kierkegaard cannot decide the matter for us, no matter how well we believe that we discern his own best intentions in the labyrinth of his works. Indeed, like a good Socratic teacher, the closer we get to the heart of the matter, the more he's likely to repel us. The attempt to understand Kierkegaard brings us all, Christian, Jew or atheist, back to the mystery of our own lives and our own being in time, seeking a happiness that time so arbitrarily seems to grant or to withhold, in which puzzlement as to whether we're monsters or angels alternates with wonder that our brave old new world can have such creatures in it. Here Kierkegaard can no longer be our teacher. We're on our own, as we should be, left to our own judgment, our own faith, our own hope, and whatever interpretative help love can offer. But it's not a matter of leaving the school of Kierkegaard, as Barth saw it. Kierkegaard, even if he was a teacher, never was a school. But at the point at which we realize he can no longer be our teacher, he may become, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and 2,000 years before him, Jesus of Galilee, wished to become to their followers, a friend, one with whom we can talk in shared puzzlement and wonder, mixing seriousness and jest, about how we might learn to humble ourselves under the limitations of being human, and in that humility, find the possibility of happiness. Thank you.